Okay, well, good evening. My name is Hadley German, and I'm the Eugene B. Adkins Curator at the Fred Jones Jr. Museum of Art. It is my pleasure to welcome you tonight to the gallery talk for Ascendant, Expressions of Self-Determination. Before we get started, I have a little bit of housekeeping to go over. Since this is a webinar, your microphone and your camera is turned off, but we welcome you to post comments or questions to our presenters throughout the program. You may do so by typing your questions into the Q&A box, which is located at the bottom of your Zoom window. Our guest presenters will respond to your questions at the end of the program. If you would like to watch tonight's gallery talk with closed captioning, you can do so by clicking the CC button located at the bottom right of your Zoom window. I want to take a moment and acknowledge on behalf of the museum and our presenters tonight the Osage and Wichita people on whose ancestral lands this exhibition is located. With the university, we fully recognize, support, and advocate for the sovereign rights of Oklahoma's 39 tribal nations. I would be remiss if I did not also acknowledge the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, whose generosity has nurtured the study of Native American art at OU and made this exhibition and the accompanying catalog possible. For those of you who don't know, Ascendant Expressions of Self-Determination was curated by 5 graduate students enrolled in a Mellon Foundation seminar in museum studies taught by Dr. Alicia Harris last fall. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Harris, who will share an overview of the exhibition and introduce the student curators who will be presenting tonight. Alicia Harris is Assistant Professor of Native American Art History at the University of Oklahoma. She received her PhD from OU, an MA in Art History from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and a BA in Art History and Curatorial Studies from Brigham Young University. Her current research centers on Native relationships with land via the visual record and the creation of place. She is interested in Native feminisms, traditional ecological knowledge, Native self-representation, sovereignty, and self-determination. She is currently working to develop a book manuscript from her dissertation, Homescapes, Indigenous Land Art and Public Memory. Alicia teaches Native American art history at OU, including courses on Native American and First Nations women and Two-Spirit artists and Native land art. She is Assiniboine and a member of the Fort Peck Assiniboine and Sioux tribes. Welcome, Alicia. We're so glad to have you in your class here today.
Thank you so much, Hadley. I really appreciate that introduction. So to get us started here, I've been asked by my community to start when I speak publicly to share our language. So I will do that now. Hehebe washte, Alicia Harris makiapi, namakoda wia, huda wichashta matakiapi, hude shanan wia, pinamia inche wichashta ishpne haja makoche ne, dayayahi. Good evening. As Hadley mentioned, my name is Alicia Harris. I am an assistant professor here in the School of Visual Arts. I am a member of the Red Bottom clan of Assiniboines from the Fort Peck Assiniboine and Sioux tribes. And it's great to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us. Very excited to share the work of the graduate students that were in my class last fall. I'm very proud of the work that they did and excited to share some of their curatorial, the sort of backside of the story with you all. So thank you so much. And also I just have to say, this exhibition comes on the heels of the exhibition Kiowa Agency. When we were thinking about curating this exhibition before the class started last summer, Hadley and I got together and we're talking about where to go next, what should be the final chapter in the Mellon exhibitions. And we started realizing that there was a fascinating story that we haven't heard before, that hasn't really been a focal point in the scholarship before. And so we started observing that there was a cohort of Native American students, MFA students here at the University of Oklahoma, painters who were Native American men, those being Chief Terry Saul, who's Choctaw and Chickasaw, Richard Dick West, who is Cheyenne, and Oscar Howe, who's Yanktonai Dakota. These men graduated from the University of Oklahoma in 1949, 1950, and 1953. And from our research, we gathered that they are the first Native people to receive MFAs in the country. I also have to pause here to just acknowledge, I understand that we have some of the descendants of those artists with us today. So thank you so much for joining us. And it's our honor to have you with us today. And we celebrate the works of your fathers. So we were observing that through looking at the works that these artists made while they were MFA students here at the University of Oklahoma, that they have a sophisticated legacy of adaptation. And this was something that each of those artists directed our attention to in their thesis work. The thesis statements that they made all pointed us back to the legacies of their own communities, art histories of abstraction, thinking about things like quill work, parfleche painting, the painted body, the ceremonial body, all have parts of sort of what we come to think of as modernism, as a modern abstraction. A lot of the scholarship about these artists has focused on that. So we wanted to look at these artists through their legacies of sophisticated adaptation. Could you go to the next slide, please? So let me introduce my class. Sorry, I should have done this first. The curatorial team, and I'm going to introduce them in the order in which they will be presenting to you. They're going to talk about different themes that they researched for this exhibition. So first is me. Hello again. The next we will have Danielle Fixico. She'll follow right after me. Then after that, we will hear from Chris Tallbear. Danielle is Chickasaw and Muskogee. Chris is Cheyenne. We'll then hear from Nathan Young, who is from the Delaware Tribe of Indians, Pawnee, Kiowa, and from the Cherokee Nation as well. Meagan Anderson Evans, and then Olivia von Gries will wrap it up, and then after that we'll have a Q&A session. Next slide, please. So when I was researching before we got started, I have long loved Oscar Howe's paintings that he created on behalf of a publication made by Oscar Jacobson, who was the first director of the University of Oklahoma Art School. And he made these works. They were published just after, while he was actually a student here at OU in 1950. These were published in France. They're pochoir paintings or prints, really beautiful color. I think that's kind of the big thing that I've always loved about them. These were held in fact in the Western History collections here on OU's campus, and I've long enjoyed looking at these. So I took an opportunity to take another look while I was researching for this exhibition, and it was striking to me that Oscar Howe chose to make paintings that were in this context of thinking about the ways that Native people have represented themselves. He painted things that were historical, ancestral people wearing ancestral clothing, ancestral regalia, but he also inserted points at which we see the sort of rupture of that historical narrative, this historical imaginary about Native people, in which he brings them into a contemporary context. So in this slide, we can see that happening where he has the Assiniboine woman. I chose that one on purpose because that's my ancestor that's being represented there. And then by contrast, he also includes this image of the Oklahoma Indian matron from 1930. If you've been to a powwow, you might see that woman today, right? There's still women who look like that in our communities here in Oklahoma and throughout Indian country today. Things like the Cheyenne warrior, maybe you see that in a Western, or this romantic idea of how we used to look, how we used to be. And he counters that by then including this painting of the young Indian from 1950, a man who's dressed in urban contemporary clothing. And I think through these paintings, he has pushed back on this imaginary that sort of erased the realities of Indian people. Next slide, please. Something else that we were really interested in, and something that I feel like has been a little bit obscured in the research about and the scholarship about these artists, is that they were living in a context that was rife with all sorts of change for Native people. Importantly, and the students' research reflects this, these changes that were taking place. But importantly, there were things that were going on legally, politically, spiritually, and socially that were delimiting the ways that Native people could represent themselves and could make claims to their own personhood. Things like, on the left here, the House Concurrent Resolution 108, which ended the federal relationship with tribal communities. By contrast, we also are in a moment when these artists are here at OU and throughout the rest of their careers, in which they reclaim some of that sovereignty, they reclaim some of that power through their artistic practices. And maybe one of the best examples that we have of that is the letter that Oscar Howe famously wrote to the Philbrook Art Center, at which he made this assertion that he was making Native art. Now, during the time that they were here as MFA students at OU, they actually write about in their theses about how Indian art has become this sort of flattened category, and they wanted to rebuff that and pull that back into its original context. And Oscar Howe's letter does that very beautifully. So I just want to say that these artists consistently point us back to various themes in Native culture and Native communities. Danielle is going to talk to us about spirituality and their cultural practice, which is at the root. This is how we organize the exhibition. So the Howe paintings are at the beginning. We started with spirituality because that is really at the root of the cultures that are being expressed throughout this exhibition. We then move on to Chris Tallbear, who's going to talk about spirituality, which was under states of duress during this period. Things like the Code of Indian Offenses, which made the practices of our religions illegal up until the 1970s, long after these artists had graduated from OU. Meagan is then going to talk about the historical tradition of warrior societies' defense of land, culture, and family that then morphs into the GI Bill, under which each of those three artists come to the University of Oklahoma. Nathan will talk about sovereignty and legal and cultural contexts. And Olivia will round us out thinking about the ways that these artists taught generations of artists. They formed and shaped the field of Native American art history, and we continue their legacy here at OU today. You'll notice that a number of our curators are Native people, and they're continuing that legacy here at OU. So enjoy. I will turn it over to my students to share their research with you, and thank you so much. Pinamia.
Hi everyone, my name is Danielle Fixico. I am Chickasaw and Muskogee Creek descendant, as our professor, Dr. Harris, noted already. I am a second year MFA candidate in painting here at OU. I worked on the spirituality section of Ascendant, but while this is the focus of my section, spirituality is really a foundational component of Native American culture. So it is a thread interwoven into all Indigenous artwork in some way. And I kind of ask that you keep that in mind as you look at the works in my section, but as well as others in the exhibition. If you can switch the slide for me. One of the pieces that really stands out to me is titled Tree of Jesse by Chickasaw and Choctaw artist and OU alumni Chief Terry Saul, who also went by Tabaski, which means ember of fire or coal. This painting really shows the juxtaposition between spirituality and religion. So the kind of traditional Western idea of religion, which highlights the sacred versus the profane, while Native American spirituality is really centered on relationships based on reciprocity. In this piece, he kind of does that physically by replacing Christian symbols from the book of Isaiah, chapter 11, parable of Jesse's lineage with Jesus Christ, such as the dove and Jesse himself, with symbols from his Native American culture, such as the water bird, which is a popular symbol of the Native American church. And he also includes a Native American man instead of Jesse in this piece, as we can see here. Another of Chief Terry Saul's pieces, if you can change the slide for me. is titled Ancient Choctaw Burial Custom, which shows his connection to these spiritual practices. This piece, while there are actually two of the same name in the exhibition, by Saul, shows how our spiritual beliefs are still in practice. Despite multiple attempts to eradicate it, it is still alive and thriving today and has been passed down for generations. For the sake of time, I won't get into too many of the details of the Choctaw burial customs, but if you are able to see the exhibition in person, the title slide next to the pieces kind of describe it based on my research. I'm also happy to answer some questions afterwards. But it is important to note that the spiritual practices of Native American people are not universal for all tribal nations. They are distinct features of each culture, and they can even be different for each community. So if you see, a depiction of a spiritual practice in a piece, it's usually very specific to that artist's tribal culture. Because of how valuable our culture is to us, each piece in this exhibition is a privilege to view, not just the ones in my spirituality section, but all of them. And I encourage you all to learn as much as you can from each of them and view the three key themes of learning, which are hearing, responding with respect, and letting the alternative view stand as that alternative and fully authentic. And with that, thank you guys so much for coming, and I appreciate the time. And I will turn the presentation over to Chris.
Good evening. Pivishiv, Moethis, Nahishivi, Natitistas. Good evening. My name's Chris Tallbear, and I'm glad to be here. I'm glad that you guys are giving us a little bit of your time. And I just, up front, I want to ask for forgiveness from my elders for speaking ahead of you. And I ask for your understanding as I speak on this, talk about this sacred ceremony of our Cheyenne people, around ceremony. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Chris Tallbear. I'm a Southern Cheyenne, and I have been around and involved with our Cheyenne traditions and ceremonies for most of my life. And I'm humbled, that those of you who've tuned in tonight to hear us speak, and I thank you for giving us, a little bit of your life, or what our old timers would call Indian time. And so with that, next slide, please. Dick West. I'd like to touch on the time frame that Dick West did this painting, Southern Cheyenne Sundance, or the Great Medicine Lodge ceremony. And this was done in 1973. At the time that Mr. West was attending the University of Oklahoma and coming out of World War II, he was a young man at that. And it was a time still when many of the Plains tribe ceremonies had been banned from being practiced, and some of them went underground or out of sight of the prying eyes of Indian agents. And for our Southern Cheyenne people, it became the willow dance, and it continued on throughout the years, and maybe not necessarily annually, but as often as it could. And we're fortunate here in the South, in Oklahoma, to still have this ceremony that we received from our northern Sitai relatives. And today our southern and northern people still go back and forth between Montana and Oklahoma, and help carry on this life-giving ceremony. This particular painting was done in 1973, about 5 years prior to ERFA, or the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, which became law in 1978. And this law, it lawfully allowed American Indians to openly and freely practice our religious ceremonies, wear eagle feathers, and, conduct practices that for hundreds of years sustained us. And so Dick West and other individuals who took it upon themselves to witness and depict these ceremonies for future generations. You know, we're thankful. Myself, I'm thankful for the attention to the detail that was provided in this and other works that he's done throughout his life and his career. And I would also wish to add that Dick West himself did not participate in this ceremony, but he did witness it, and he consulted heavily with respected Cheyenne men who gave him permission to depict these important ceremonial events. You know, and for the importance of ceremony, and without the benevolence of you know, the Ma'yan or our great mysteries, we would have a tough time in this world. Together and as one, this and other ceremonies are carried out for the love and continued existence of our people. Other ritualistic parts of the ceremony are carried on throughout the lodge that you see before you. And I'm talking about this ceremony in front of us, this picture. For this to be a life-given ceremony, a male and female pledger are required for life to continue on, you know, for the people. Symbology plays a huge role in ceremony. What it represents to those in participating is determined through ritualistic actions. And like Danielle, you know, without going into too much detail, I would like to say collectively that, you know, the sum total of all these parts that you see going on in this lodge, it equals up to our ceremony, or what we call Hachwim, or New Life Lodge. You know, and you know, on the other part, I'm also a student of anthropology, and for some of you guys who get into the ethereal, when you think about what communitas is in relation to this painting, communitas, it is the intense community spirit, the feeling of great social equity, solidarity, and togetherness. Communitas is characteristic of people experiencing liminality together, and liminality is a state of transition between one stage and the next, especially between major stages in one's life or during a rite of passage. And, you know, collectively, like I said, these elements are represented through the ceremony. And, you know, for those of us who have gone through this, we help carry each other through when things get tough. You know, we take on extra burdens so that as a whole, we come through together. We help hold up those who need help and share our resources and strengths so that together we can celebrate our Cheyenne New Year. Next slide, please. All right. This is one of his more interesting examples of what we call surrealism. This is the Wedding of Art and Science in 1949, and I'm by far not an expert in surrealism, unless you want to count the finger paintings that I do out in the garage when my wife isn't around. I'm going to give this my best shot. Dick West and other students while at OU studied under modern European-influenced art instructors who encouraged their students to take their expressions beyond what was called traditional Indian paintings and experiment with other methods, blending Cubism, Expressionism, and Surrealism. A stunning example of work that came from that is Dick West's The Wedding of Art and Science. And, you know, it's kind of a special area. It's taken some quotes from another paper that was presented. It was a special realm of surrealism where symbols take the place of realistic representations in the dream world. And the Wedding of Art and Science, it brings together colors, elements, designs of abstract reasoning. And this particular painting took first prize at the Association of Oklahoma Artists 10th Annual. And if anybody ever has the opportunity to look up and find Dick West's master's thesis, I would definitely highly recommend that. You know, the colors, the designs, the human-like form that you see in here, the abstract elements coming together, forming a union of elements, design, and great imagination. With that, I'm going to leave it there for you to individually take in his expression of art and determine what it means to you personally based upon your own experience and beliefs. Hene Hane, that's all I have to say, and we'll go on to our next presenter. Thank you.
Nathan, I think you're muted.
It's a great way to start. Hi, everybody. My name is Nathan Young. I'm Delaware Tribe of Indians, Pawnee, Kiowa, and a citizen of the Cherokee Nation. I'm a PhD student in the Native American Art History Department here at the University of Oklahoma. Next slide, please. Oscar Howe's watercolor, Untitled, a maquette for a mural completed at Fort Thompson Day School, a study for a large-scale mural. An example of how artists of this generation were reimagining a future that had yet to be widely contemplated, but would soon emerge and articulate itself as the contemporary tribal sovereignty we know today. Artworks like Howe's inspired those who wished for a better future for their communities and lands. Howe's painting can be read as an example of early visual sovereignty in art. In it, we see a world where one dimension is indiscernible from another, each a portal to the next. Imagining new worlds and facing the unimaginable was a reality that first Americans had to continually contemplate since contact with Anglo-Europeans. In Howe's watercolor, we can imagine a new world for our nations and our land. In this image, we see a world that does not simply have to be read as an idealized past, but as an aspiration for the future. Artists like Howe, West, and Saul represent the vanguard of countless others who would go on to assert these same ideas in the field of law, education, economics, and any field imaginable. Next slide, please. Another artist featured in Ascendant is the Luswano artist, Fritz Scholder, known as a master of color. Scholder was also deeply concerned with the perception of the American Indian in the popular culture, as well as the complications and contradictions in all human experiences. Scholder confronted these topics in his practice and in the lithograph, Cowboy Indian. We see the artist using vibrant colors against a stark background to depict an American Indian cowboy, a contradiction in terms to many. Scholder's Cowboy Indian is rendered in typical cowboy fashion, careless and carefree, with his brightly colored shirt, collar turned upward, wearing dark colored sunglasses and a lit cigarette dangling from his lips. The look on the cowboy's face seems to be that of amusement, as if he understands something we do not. Scholder seems to be confronting the dichotomy of cowboys versus Indians here, complicating the narrative with the knowledge that American Indian cowboys have existed as long as any other cowboy. Horsemanship had become an essential way of life for many tribal communities, and Scholder's Cowboy Indian exemplifies the continuation of this tradition. Scholder's work represents the ability of American Indians to adapt and excel in any field they wish. Both Howe and Scholder seem to be staking a claim for the future of the lives of first Americans, a reality where there are no limits, a world where people are free to determine their fate, unencumbered by many long-held patronizing assumptions and ideas. Ascendant, Expressions of Self-Determination, expresses a visual sovereignty that developed at the same time that the Red Power movement was emerging. This movement sought to revitalize American Indian life from within after centuries of subjugation by foreign nations. The Red Power movement had a huge influence on generations of American Indians who understood that tribal nations had the right to self-determination or sovereignty. Sovereignty is the inherent right of a people to govern themselves, and the root of contemporary tribal sovereignty can be seen in the work of the artists featured in this exhibition. These artworks and ideas inspired generations of America's first peoples and represent a turning point in American Indian history, where tribal nations began to conceptualize and practice new forms of agency and governance, economic self-dependence, and spiritual practice. These new forms of self-determination informed and inspired the contemporary tribal nations that we are all familiar with today. Thank you.
Great, thank you. For centuries, Native American nations have fought to defend their land and communities. Not every tribe has a warrior tradition, but each tribe has a tradition of protecting its people. Native Americans serve in the armed forces at a higher per capita rate than any other demographic, and the 1944 Servicemen's Readjustment Act, or GI Bill, allowed many veterans economic and education-related opportunities. Like Dr. Harris mentioned, artists Dick West, Chief Terry Saul, and Oscar Howe attended OU on the GI Bill, becoming the first Native students to earn MFAs. Slide. Starting in the 45th Infantry Division, Saul achieved the rank of First Sergeant. In this work, Salvage, the viewer looks out of a cockpit at a flat space with objects that include ladders and tail fins. The painting depicts the airfield in Norman at North Base, where the Navy had a training program. This airfield is also visible from the artist's home. This work is emblematic of Saul's desire to disrupt the expected aesthetics of the so-called Indian painting of his time and depicts war through his eyes. He noted, quote, "All of my paintings have Indian themes in contemporary style. This is a combination of line, design, and color," unquote. To a veteran like Saul, an image of the instruments of combat now fallen into disuse and disarray may have resonated with his memories of the recent war. The contemporary shift in what was now considered Indian art, or what was considered quote-unquote Indian art, was marked by a modernist turn and is also significant as it continues to tell a story of warriors. Slide. Many of Kiowa artist T.C. Cannon's works in this exhibition relate to themes of war and warriors. Each tribe identifies warriors and leaders in unique ways. Warriors are more than just soldiers. They are people who serve tribal communities. Some common symbols associated with Native warriors are eagle feathers and war bonnets. In this painting, Cannon depicts a stoic man with a stern expression. A feather hangs from his hair, most likely alluding to his status as a warrior. Eagle feathers are symbols of honor, as the eagle's courage and strength are believed to be carried within the feather. Wearing an eagle feather symbolizes the same traits in a person. And T.C. Cannon is also known for his poetry, and I wanted to include a poem here in this webinar so that you can get an idea of his career, not only as an artist, but also as a poet. He writes a poem called "Another Indian Bites the Dust," and it starts, "Well, the right things happen to those it must. So another Indian bit the dust. 'Twas when it struck me plain and clear, that question, what am I doing here? I'm supposed to be speechless on the reservation, selling cigars at a trading post. So I sent a smoke signal to Washington town, and the president sent a note back. Said, TC son, you've got to stay, because you killed Custer and you're gonna pay for this country that now belongs to me. And so I live from day to day in the army of the USA, with my mind fixed on that final minute when the world arrives with one less Indian in it." Slide. Since contact, Native Americans have endured many myth-based and dehumanizing stereotypes. Terms such as savage, uncivilized, and warrior were frequently assigned to natives to justify settler conquest. In this painting, shoulder resists an ethnographic reading of an honored warrior whose war bonnet is perched atop his head. The war bonnet has become an often misappropriated indicator of Native culture and combat status. However, the warrior tradition is not only about combat. Rather, Native men and women fill the warrior role through military service, protecting their language, guarding the culture, and providing food, shelter, education, and medical assistance to community members. These works and others allude to the complicated politics of identity and self for Native Americans in the United States military. Just as the artists themselves were warriors or protectors during times of war, their art also reflects themes of warrior tradition. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Olivia, and I am a PhD in Art of the American West student here at OU, and I'm very excited to be speaking with you tonight. For Ascendant, I focused on the legacy section of the show, even though you can easily see the theme of legacy throughout the entire exhibition. But for tonight, I'm going to focus even more specifically on Dick West, one of his professors at the University of Oklahoma, and one of his students from Bacone College, all of whom are represented in our show in the legacy section. On the screen here, we see an artistic example from each. On the far left, we have Nakadich, or Sun, by Leonard Good. In the middle, we have Water Serpent by Dick West. And on the far right, we have We Were Strong Then and We Were Happy by Virginia Stroud. Before his artistic education at the University of Oklahoma, Dick West began his formal artistic studies at Bacone College in Muskogee, Oklahoma, where he studied under A.C. Blue Eagle, a Muskogee Creek artist also represented in our show. After his service in the United States Navy, West enrolled at the University of Oklahoma, where he studied under a young cohort of studio professors inspired by European modernism. Specifically, West worked with painting professor Leonard Good, who served as his major advisor. While Good tended to emphasize the figure in his work, as seen in Nakadich, or Sun, he also showcased an intimate knowledge of planes and shadows. A former student of University of Oklahoma Art School director Oscar Jacobson, Good was fascinated with the figure throughout his entire career. In his 20s, Good moved to Louisiana to teach and developed an interest in creating portraits of the residents of his town. In a profile about Good, Jacobson notes that these portraits, often in blue pencil such as Nakadich, display not only quote-unquote solid constructions, but also reflect the sitter's character. While teaching at OU, Good encouraged his students, including Chief Terry Saul, Dick West, and Oscar Howe, to use figures in their artwork. But he was also known for allowing his students to do what they thought was best with their work. His approach was passed down to West, who engaged with his professor's instructions in differing ways due to his tribal affiliation and artistic past. In artwork from the University of Oklahoma, West worked with the figure in some regard, perhaps at the encouraging of Good. At the same time, he also emphasized planarity and linear construction in his compositions. Contrasting the style of artwork that he created before his MFA program, the explicit emphasis on planarity and linear construction seen in West's work during or soon after his time at OU, as exemplified by Water Serpent, could highlight the lingering influences of Good and painting faculty member John O'Neill on his artistic production. O'Neill is also included in the legacy section of our exhibit and was known for his abstracted geometric compositions. It is important to remember, however, that West's tribe has had a long artistic tradition of making both figural and abstract art outside of the Western Academy. While West created a vast amount of figural work throughout his career, in his thesis, he notes that abstract subject matter such as the snake and water serpent enables critical examinations of emotions and states of mind. When West left the University of Oklahoma, he perpetuated the teachings of his artistic instructors through his own endeavor as an art educator. Before capping his career at Haskell Indian Nations University in Kansas, West served as the director of Bacone College's art department and was well received during his tenure. One of his students was Virginia Stroud, who, as a resident of the Murrow Children's Home at Bacone College, met Dick West during his time as Bacone's art director. The pair immediately took a liking and interest in one another, and Stroud knew from a very young age that she wanted to be an artist. During her time as a child hanging around Bacone's art department, and later as an enrolled student at Bacone College, Stroud learned immensely from West, who described her as having, quote, the color sense of Picasso, end quote. He encouraged her to study and draw from her family history in her artwork as he had done in his. And we can see this clearly in We Were Strong Then and We Were Happy. As a whole, the thread of legacy runs throughout the entirety of Ascendant, as demonstrated by the artwork contained within. All three artists that we focused on, Dick West, Oscar Howe, and Chief Terry Saul, drew from their tribe's artistic heritages and their educational backgrounds to create unique styles, which they then passed down to their artistic descendants who are represented in our show. Thank you.
Thank you to the students, and thank you, Alicia, for starting off the program tonight. We've now moved on to the Q&A session of our program. So we'll now take time for questions and comments from the audience, and you can type those questions into the Q&A box on your Zoom window. And we already have one. We have some distinguished guests in the audience. Tonight, we're really fortunate to have members of Dick West's family. And Dick West Jr. has asked, do paintings like The Marriage of Art and Science, along with other abstract works by Dick West of this period, represent his effort to address questions that were of importance to both natives and non-natives, more universal? So I think all of you might want to take a stab at that, but I know, Chris, you had something you wanted to say.
Honestly, I really liked what Olivia was saying. She seemed to do some great research into that, and I would love to hear her perspective on that first.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Yeah, so this is a really great question, and I think it touches on some key themes that we touch on ourselves throughout the exhibit. So before our exhibit, there had been one kind of major article written about these artists, which really framed them kind of in, I guess, like in the lens of European modernism. And I think that with Dick West's work, like The Marriage of Art and Science, which was created, I believe, during his MFA program here, and Water Serpent, which was created, I think, just after, he really is navigating both native and non-native art worlds and like the United States as a whole to deal with these universal issues. So I think as I touched on a little bit, and as we touch on even more in our show, you know, Native tribes have had long, very, very long artistic traditions, especially working in both abstracted and figural work. So I see Dick West's abstracted work that he created at OU as just a continuation of this tradition. I think he also, you know, was receiving feedback from his professors like John O'Neill and Leonard Good, who might have pointed him to like specific European abstracted artistic movements, like what Chris said, like surrealism, expressionism, abstract expressionism, etc. But again, this idea that they were working in abstraction rather than figural work wasn't anything new, because that was an artistic practice that their tribes had established, you know, long before.
I also want to kind of point out too, I liked what you said, but what you're asking about his effort to address questions that were of importance to both natives and non-natives, more universal. And I kind of, what came to mind was the religious series that he had produced, and you know, a universal Christ, and those kind of elements with native folks that are adopting Christianity, which is reflected in a lot of the artist's work, you know, with Chief Terry Saw and Dick West, that it's reflective. So that, I think he was trying to maybe find a balance and express it through that way. That's just my thoughts.
Well, we have another comment from Jim and Elaine West. And Jim asks, do any of you see a relationship between the realistic representation of ceremonies or symbology by these artists and the spiritual and emotional the spiritual and emotional expression in their abstract or surrealistic paintings? Do you want me to repeat that? Did you all get it? Okay, I'll read it again. Do any of the students see a relationship between the realistic representation of ceremonies / symbology by these artists and the spiritual and emotional expression in their abstract or surreal paintings?
You know, I think with the colors, you know, the primary colors that Dick West used in some of those abstract paintings, and the symbology that was produced in there, you know, a lot of our elements and symbols that go on in our ceremonies that they've depicted, you know, that kind of gets represented and bleeds through in a abstract way. I do see those myself, but that's just my own experience from being on both sides.
Danielle, I see you nodding. Did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, sure. I'll jump in. Yeah, I agree with Chris that you can definitely see a lot of their color usage and a lot of like the motions that they have in their brushwork kind of exhibits a lot of emotion from the viewer. I also think that another piece, which is also really beautiful and one of my favorites, which unfortunately didn't make the cut for the presentation, was Oscar Howe's Wasi. I'm sorry, I might be butchering that. Also known as He Is Dancing, kind of combines the two together. He has a lot of the abstract shapes in the background with a ceremonial dancer in the front, and I think kind of marries the two together.
Can I just say something really quick here? I completely agree, and I also just have to point out that in the exhibition, I commend the students for thinking about this, because we noticed when the works were getting hung that they talk to each other in really interesting ways. And I think that question, thinking about how the realistic representation and these abstract representations function together for those artists, right? And that they really do convey the same message in some ways through completely different forms, right? And it's quite fascinating to see the works engage with one another in the gallery space. So yeah, I think that's something that's pretty consistent throughout the exhibition. And that's on the decision of the students' curatorial practice. So so good job, everybody, for making those, making them sing together in some ways.
Yeah, I might jump in and add, I'm sorry for all of you who aren't in Norman because you can't see this exhibition in person. And there are really nice juxtapositions within the gallery between works by the same artist and then of course works by different artists. And you can tour the exhibition virtually on our website. And I believe pretty soon there should be a link in the chat where you can go and tour it, and you can walk through and see how the spaces relate and other works that are in the exhibition than what the students were able to share tonight. Okay, well, I have a question for you all while we give our attendees time to type additional comments. And that is about the letter from Oscar Howe to Jeannie Snodgrass King. And you mentioned to us, to my colleagues and I, that the letter really determined your course for the exhibition, really from the first day of the class. And I wondered if you could share a little bit about that, about your experience reading the letter and how it was key to your thinking about the exhibition and the themes that you developed in the exhibit.
I have something to say, but I want to hear from the students first.
Oh, okay.
Were you directing that question to me?
No, really. I think that I'm curious what they have to say, but I want to hear what you have to say too, Alicia. We had such a nice conversation about this the other day, and I think our audience might like to hear about that.
Okay, I'll leave it to the students to go ahead and speak, and then I'll finish up.
I'll jump in here. I think, it's part of the Western art historical tradition to create kind of compartmentalize and to organize and to kind of create organizations to define what a style is, to create a convention. Well, these are the limits of this. This is not Cubist. This is not Impressionist. This is not that. And I think that at this point, for these artists, it's purely a sense of, again, just to kind of use some of the words that I often use, it's another form of agency and self-determination. It is for American Indians to decide what American Indian art is. And I believe it is a little bit, I'm not sure of Miss Snodgrass's heritage. She may have been of American Indians. Something came up like that, I think, in our research, or somebody mentioned it. Possibly, I know there were other American Indians that didn't view those works as quote Indian art. But to me, it's really just simply a form of agency and really just refusing to be told what to paint, how to paint, and who they are.
I appreciate them speaking up for us, and at a time when, it probably wasn't a good time, it wasn't cool to, I guess, go against the grain. So, yeah, I'm glad that they did. I'm glad they did the stuff that they did, and didn't fit into that box, didn't let it define us. And maybe that's something as Native people, we're constantly exerting our sovereignty and striving for that and that self-determination. And, maybe we need to kind of flip that too and ask, what happens when we get that? What are we going to do? How are we going to feel? Maybe we need to start accepting that, and I think in a lot of ways, we've already realized that, but haven't accepted that.
Alicia, go ahead. Sorry, Danielle, you go ahead.
You're totally fine. I feel like it definitely set the tone for the class, and was really a lot of inspiration for like, should we compromise on this, or should we maybe like not address this issue, or kind of tiptoe around this? And it was like, no, if Hal can speak up against so much against him, and then we can address what we want to and make the decisions that we want for this exhibition. And I feel like it was just a really big inspiration to us as a class.
I have a comment as well. If you haven't been to the exhibition yet or haven't visited the virtual link, the education department helped us to make the letter very large and paste it onto the wall at the end of the exhibition. And there's a place for guests to write how they're challenging narratives and challenging these boxes that they're being put into, and helping those around them to exercise their own sovereignty and agency. And there's a place to write letters and stick them on the wall. And I'm in the Fred a couple of times a week, and I go up there and read the ones that are public. And it's so amazing to see how Oscar Howe not only had this profound influence on Native art, on American art history, period, but how people just reading that letter after visiting the exhibit, how that's clearly influencing them. And I'm grateful for his continuing influence in all these areas now. So.
Yeah, we were talking just before the webinar, and Amanda, our head of education, said 131 people had taken notes to either write responses and share, take them home, or share them in a box where they won't be opened, which is pretty amazing in just 2 weeks that many people have really felt compelled by that letter, by Oscar Howe's letter, to respond. Olivia or Alicia, did you want to say anything else about that?
Yeah, I was just going to say that I totally agree with my co-curators. I think they all brought up some really awesome points, and Danielle especially, this idea that reading this letter at the beginning of the course did absolutely set the tone. And I think we all knew this, but it certainly was a really strong message saying that there's nothing that we had to conform to. And when we were trying to figure out when we were trying to figure out the title of the exhibit, we jokingly threw out, it's Indian art, damn it. And I think that was a really, phrased more academically, but that was a really strong guiding principle, and something that was totally reflected in Howe's letter. This idea that he was rejected from the annual because the style of art he submitted didn't fit one of these predetermined categories was just something false and needing to be pushed back against, which he did. And like Megan said, I think we're all really grateful for him writing that letter and for all of his work throughout, the Native art field.
Oh, I kind of wish you had suggested that as a title.
I think we threw it around a bunch. Then we decided you guys would probably say no.
I don't know about that, honestly.
All right, we'll do it again.
Yeah,
I just want to say that, exactly to the point that the students are making here, that this, I scheduled them to read this letter very early on because I wanted it to set the standard for what we were doing. And time again, we would come back in our, the process of curating this exhibition with students and with, with varying levels of curatorial practice, curatorial experience, was an incredible, the students really gelled together in their ideas. But this was the point at which we all kind of made a decision that we're going to do what we want to do. And we felt sort of underwritten by Howe's statements and by his letter. And the same is true for all of the artists in the exhibition. I think they all were working towards this degree of self-determination, of the full expression of their identity, of their personhood, of their ideas, as they navigated through the changes that were going on around them, navigating with these institutions that had established barriers against what they were trying to do. I also have to say that though that letter was written to the Philbrook, the Philbrook actually ended up partnering in some ways with us for this exhibition, in that a number of the works that we have in the show are on loan from the Philbrook. And so it's just an interesting kind of turn of events then to have that letter hanging in a gallery that has works on loan from the actual institution that it was addressed to. I think is testament to the power of their statements and to the artwork that they created as well. So yeah, it's sort of a full circle moment in that gallery where the letter is very large in that gallery. So yeah, it's moving, it's really powerful, and I think that it really kind of creates a dynamic in that space that's unique.
I might add, Christina Burke, who's the curator at the Philbrook, was so helpful in loaning works to the show. Some really great, the really great, completely abstract Dick West paintings. She said it just to the panelists that letter was a catalyst for the Indian Annual, Philbrook, and Native Art, and still is. And yeah, you're right, Christina. Thanks so much for being here and for your help in supporting the students and the exhibition. We had one more question from Dick West, and he asks, is there a connection between these works as art and the Native culture that shapes and grounds them that is different from the canons of Western art, where that connection is not assumed? It's kind of an existential question.
I have some thoughts on that.
Okay.
I think that in some ways, the answer is yes. There is a connection. I think that all art is grounded in its culture. It does represent the ideas that emerges from, and it has that in common. I would say to address the notion of the difference between the canon of Western art and the type of American Indian art that we have been able to had the honor to exhibit, is that there are power relationships. That oftentimes when we study art history, and in my experience, it's often about, it's kind of a top-down approach. You have benefactors such as the church, wealthy people, and they're kind of marketing ideas, I guess, for lack of a better word. These artists were actually, it was a challenge to express themselves in this way. Their whole existence, their ancestors' whole lives had been very difficult because of historical circumstances. And so it's an art that is, grounded out of this, a love for a culture that was being suppressed and oftentimes kind of at odds with the rest of the world, it seemed, and with the world that maybe wanted them to, or maybe thought that American Indians had, or Native Americans had disappeared. And I think in a sense that's a really, to me, whenever I walk through a museum and I see art from the Renaissance or another era, and I see American Indian art, I see emerging from two very different places. And I think that's a part of the beauty of this work, is that it's not really it comes from a place of true earnestness and a real love and real purpose.
Well, we have another question from Jim and Elaine West that I want to make sure we get to. And they say, first of all, we really appreciate your work on these artists and their work. My father, Dick West, was very curious about the world around him throughout his entire life. Is this a characteristic shared with other artists in the exhibition? And I think you all can respond to that about the artists you were working on specifically. And while you're at it, you might, this was a question I had been curious about, if there's anything about these artists that surprised you as you were working on the project. But please field the West's question first. Was this curiosity about the world around Dick West, was that something you found in the other artists' work as well?
Yeah, I think absolutely we see that with all of the other artists, and I can speak about it for my section in particular, but one of the works in the legacy section is by Jean-Claude Smith in the future, and she's really dealing with kind of like racial politics and racial mixing across the world and engaging with some like really deep history and making these really, really layered connections that way. And I think we see that in different forms with the different artists, whether they're really concerned with like their personal history, regional history, United States history, or the world, they all were kind of navigating between these realms and, working through their thoughts on them, sometimes expressing that visually in the art that we have on display. But I think just to like summarize, yes, these artists were intensely curious about the world around them, and they produced really great art reflecting that. And for Hadley's question, if I was surprised by anything while researching, I guess I'm like constantly surprised by these artists, but like in a really pleasant way, where I'm like, of course, it makes sense that they're making this reference. Of course they are. But for me, working on legacy and specifically with Chief Terry Saul and Dick West at Bacone College, it was a funny moment for me because I was actually adjuncting at Bacone at the time I was writing about them. So it was really cool to be working with this history and then talking to my students there about these people, these predecessors. Most of my students were studio students. So it was really cool to kind of like be a little part of this legacy in one way, and then like go talk to my students who are like very much part of the artistic legacy at Bacone.
That's really cool. Anyone else? Do you have anything to add?
I would add one thing too. I think that there is, that I saw a sense of an interest of an intertribal interest. You saw people engaging, other traditions and new traditions, and it's not purely, some of the artists are not necessarily like they're exploring different spiritual practices and things like that. And it's very evident that they're human beings just like everybody else, and they're very curious about the world, but we're also very curious about each other as American Indians, and we also have a lot of interest in our ways and learning them and kind of having that community and fellowship with each other. So I could see that as an undercurrent every time I walk through there, that there's an interest, and it's their little subtle things throughout all the paintings that, or it might be a painting done by somebody that's not even about their practice. It might be another tribal practice.
I was impressed by the gosh, the talent that Dick West had, you know, with a pocket knife and being able to create sculpture, you know, and looking at the abstract and the two-dimensional. And you know, what fascinated me was the attention to detail that he put into even looking at the moccasins that you know, figures in paintings that he did. You know, we can learn from those things. So I was impressed with just how he crossed so many lines, you know, and he didn't let it define them.
I agree with everything that has been said, those last three comments. And I especially wanted to touch on, I think in every single section, you see this curiosity about the world, and like Nathan was saying, with each other. And further, we see that in every element of every work. I think you can say that statement. And it's interesting. It was interesting to me when studying about the tradition of warriordom. You have artists who served in Vietnam, who served in Korea, who served in World War II, whose father served in World War I. You have this long legacy, and just being able to study these depictions of warriordom as it relates to cultures and tribes and the influence of the United States government and politics and policies and the convergence there. And Hadley asked if there was anything that we were surprised by, right? And something I was surprised by was just how little scholarship is out there about Native American influence, Native Americans serving in the armed forces. So that's something that this project has helped me to realize and want to do more scholarship on, because there's this long legacy. There's all these lives that have been touched and influenced. And I think that there is so much more work that can be done to honor these men and women.
Okay, well, I want to give Alicia, you and Danielle, I guess, didn't get to answer that question. So if there's anything the two of you would like to add before I wrap this up for the evening, please, I'd love for you to feel like you have time to do so.
Sure, if everybody else is throwing my 2 cents. Well, as an artist myself, and I think Nathan can agree, we're just kind of curious by nature. We can kind of torture ourselves with our curiosity sometimes. We have to see what something's going to look like, no matter how much time it's going to take to do so. Yeah, I think we really are just curious about the world and exploring different ways to express ourselves and interpret the world that we have around us. And as far as being surprised, is I was really kind of shocked by the connections that these artists have. I had never realized it before. And we had so many of these big name artists that I've heard before multiple times, but I had no idea that, you know, Dick West would go on to teach these other great Native American artists. But after learning that, like, you can definitely see the lineage that they had, and just thinking about like where Native art would be if they hadn't, you know, taken that step out by themselves at the time that they did.
Yeah, that's kind of the point that I wanted to do, is that they were not only curious about the world, but they were like so deeply engaged in it, right? Like that they were very active people, very involved with various institutions, you know, really, really invested in living their lives really beautifully, and you know, participating in a lot of different ways. And I also just wanted to mention to Megan's point about the lack of scholarship about Native Americans in the military. We had a really hard time. I commend Megan for her work trying to find information about those three artists coming to OU on the GI Bill. If anybody has any research about that, I would love to see it. We couldn't find anything, and really appreciate the hard work that she did in trying to find some of that. But we are still searching for it. So if anybody in the audience finds any information about Native people using the GI Bill to get their educations, we'd love to see that. But yeah, I think that it's something that it's a legacy. And again, I also just want to say, like, all of this is here, right? It's something that we continue with the legacy. We bask in this legacy here at OU, and with the Fred, the partnerships that we have here, I think is pretty phenomenal. So again, it's part of, that's kind of the surprising thing to me, to think about, like, this is where it all happened, right? It was here, and we're in it, and it's pretty neat. So thank you.
As Olivia said, you're part of, I think it was Olivia, you're part of that legacy. I mean, that's really kind of fantastic, everyone in this program. We have a lot of nice comments in the chat, and thank you to all of you attendees who have joined us this evening. I want to thank the West family for being here. Like, what a treat to have you all here. And I would be remiss if I didn't say that the museum is always happy to share the permanent collection with artists and their families and relatives. So if you're in Norman and you'd like to see any material in our collection, whether it's on view or not, please feel free to get in touch with me. You can find my contact information on the website, and we'll set up an appointment for you to do that. Okay, well, thank you, Alicia. Thank you to our student curators. We hope that you all in the audience will visit Ascendant Expressions of Self-Determination before it closes on August 14th. So it's up through the summer. It's located in the Sandor Mezzanine Gallery, which is on the 3rd floor of the museum. In the gallery, you'll also be able to pick up complimentary copies of the exhibition catalog. So I've got a copy of it here to show you. It's a beautifully designed book. And again, these are provided free of charge thanks to the Mellon Foundation. And as I said before, if you're unable to visit the exhibition in person, you can tour it virtually on the exhibits page of our website. And there is a link in the chat window to the virtual tour. Thank you again, everyone, for joining tonight. I want to give a shout out here at the end to our esteemed emeritus professor, Dr. Jackson Rushing, who's in the audience tonight, and without whose instrumental work at OU in recent years on the Mellon Grant and also teaching many of the people who are in this room, I don't think that we could have done it without you, Jack. We owe you a great deal of thanks. And finally, I want to thank Alicia and the students. You've done such a great job. Your hard work and your vision is really evident in the gallery. You've organized something that's truly beautiful and thought-provoking, that really demonstrates the lasting legacies of these important artists who passed through OU just following World War II. So on behalf of the museum and all of our attendees tonight, congratulations, well done. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.